I want to start and maybe reframe. I'm not going to change all the PowerPoints, but it's really a situation of re-regulation. So for all my libertarian friends in Washington, I'm sorry, the utopia has not happened, it will not happen. And how do we see that manifest? Well, we see it manifest in ways like tariffs. This administration is keen on using tariffs, and they're keen on suggesting that if they lose a Supreme Court case, they have two other mechanisms to utilize tariffs. We've seen this direct investment wave where this government is actually asking companies to come to Washington and we will give you money. It's our money, by the way, in case you guys didn't really know that. So again, we've seen this administration start to understand the power of regulation. Now they're doing it in different ways, and I think we're going to talk about, and other panels have talked about, the shifts in regulation, but I don't want folks to walk away from here thinking that Washington is the Wild West and no one's regulating anyone. I think this administration is very keen, and I should note that in the first Trump administration, they added over 1,500 pages to the Federal Register from the 8-year Obama administration. So they're all about it. They're just going about it in a different way.
We'll open it up to the full panel here, and if what the vantage point is from both inside the company and outside the company, what you're seeing in terms of interactions with the federal government.
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. I'm Vikrum Aiyer. I head up public policy for a energy tech company that's in the carbon removal space. Previously was a deputy director at the ACLU and the head of policy for a division of Uber. And my vantage point as to what has changed in federal government comes from having spent time in the Obama White House and Commerce Department. I do not think this is the era of deregulation. I think it is just exactly as you said, Vince, it's doing things slightly differently. And I think two clear examples of that from my vantage point. If you touch or represent clients in the AI space, you can see the White House OSTP guidance from a few months back on creating a sandbox for AI companies to play ball as a form of less rules, more innovation, go do your thing. You could interpret that as a deregulatory approach. But what you get in response is a ton of state action that has been unpacked here earlier, including in the California legislative session this past year. Another example is the EPA. I do carbon management. They tried to take away the greenhouse gas reporting requirement. The EPA administrator just announced this a couple of weeks ago, thought it was too onerous for heavy emitters, for oil and gas. It has created a tizzy in terms of how the Treasury Department is now going to create carbon accounting mechanisms for a slew of tax credits that were preserved in the big, beautiful bill. So I don't actually think that this is a moment of deregulation. I think this is a moment where government affairs representatives, such as myself, are getting hired into companies way earlier on if they have one tiny bit of a nexus to Washington, D.C., so they can figure out how they go about doing this. And then I'll just end by saying, as a company that has, and we can dig into this later if it's helpful, Mark, but as a company that has won significant federal funding under the Biden administration, and now we're working on navigating reviews under this administration, reviews of a grant are not regulation, but how you go about appealing those reviews, continuing your progress if it hasn't been terminated, and how you work through that, or how do you cut new deals with this administration, are new forms of insights that I think boardrooms, CEOs are all grappling with. So I think this is a Trump-era version of using the word deregulation and business certainty to create anything but.
Now, I'd be happy to talk about this. I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective. I don't interact with the government. Occasionally I'll call the SEC to help facilitate a deal that I'm working on. But I do advise companies and clients in a variety of different industries. And I think the new administration and their approach to regulation and their approach to handling matters that you were just talking about, have impacted these industries. And so at some level, all of my public company clients have reporting requirements. And under the prior administration, there were numerous disclosure requirements related to climate, related to a number of different areas where there's been a real pullback in this administration. I also would observe that this administration has made a real effort to think about how to make going public, being a public company, easier. The rulemaking in this area is at the very early stages. There are other areas where there is more involvement from the government. And so, I also work with a number of private companies. And those private companies often are taking investments from foreign investors, foreign companies from time to time. Sometimes there's outbound investments. There's much more scrutiny over that than there was in the prior administration. Not that there was none, it's just at a heightened level. There are a number of different industries where there is a lot of activity in the regulation area. So you mentioned AI, and I think your observation that the federal government might have pulled back, but the states have really stepped up in the regulatory area here is a good observation. Crypto is a little bit of a different era where there was a lot of uncertainty and there was a perceived hostility toward the crypto industry from the last administration. This administration has made it clear that they are very much in favor of making it easier for crypto-based companies to operate with some certainty under the law. And then you have situations, I work with a number of energy companies, in particular, what you would call alternative energy companies. And some of those have wins behind their sales now because of priorities from this administration. And others of them are now in a little bit of a disfavored category. And so I spend a lot of time with boards and management teams helping navigate that, planning strategy for that. But it's a real mix. I wouldn't say it's one or the other, and it depends on what the priorities of the administration are and what industry you find yourself in and whether you're a private company or a public company. But you have to pay attention to the changes in the environment and in the law.
Not much to add because I think most of you have said it all, but I'd say it's definitely not deregulation. I think it's an era of paring back some outdated regulations that we've seen already, and we'll see a lot more coming forward. But there's a lot of things to regulate. For example, I'm the chief legal officer of an autonomous vehicle company. And like Mark was saying, you could have it on the state level, regulations of autonomous vehicles like Waymo or us here in California. But it would be much better to have it on the federal level. And I think the federal government is going to be pro-business and is going to be pushing forth regulations that hopefully help this industry or AI or, like you said, Mark, crypto to have some more certainty going forward.
Great. So this question, I think, is for Vikram and possibly Phil. I wish I knew a little more about exactly what all of the hats are that chief legal officers wear, especially at startups. So you might have something here as well. But from being inside of a firm and trying to interface with the government, has your strategy changed now with the Trump administration? So obviously, you mentioned getting grants for carbon capture. I imagine that is not like top priority of the Trump administration at the moment. And so how do you go about still kind of working for your client? Is it kind of the balkanization of the administration, finding who would be the receptive ear? Is it working with other branches of government to kind of safeguard what you already have? What is the strategy now when there's such a large change?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer that in two ways. One is conceptual, one is tactical. So on the concept level, just to take a step back, Heirloom patented a way in partnership with Columbia, UPenn, and the national labs to heat up limestone. Limestone is very unsexy. It's in chalk, it's in toothpaste, it's very cheap to source. If you heat limestone, it breaks it apart into in a chemical equation that loses a molecule of carbon. So if I were to heat that limestone and put it right in this room, not even in a fancy industrial facility, it would just start binding to atmospheric CO2. Biden administration loved this. We cut a ribbon on a facility out here in California in 2023. We won $600 million under the Biden infrastructure law to scale this from the West Coast to the Gulf Coast. Conceptually, I don't think this administration sees carbon dioxide as a liability. I think our tactical shift on the concept is to reframe how you utilize CO2 as a commodity. And that is actually not bullshit. It's not just spinning to kowtow to an administration. There is actual value chain value to carbon dioxide. You can combine CO2 with other molecules like hydrogen and create a more sustainable aviation fuel. The military has interest in that application because they claim the Air Force can refuel fewer times in theaters of war. AI hyperscalers are purchasing carbon removals, not just from our company Heirloom, but several of our competitors, in part to manage the waste heat when they talk to local communities about the fright of 7 football stadium-sized data centers going online, and to ship LNG. If America wants to be a great LNG exporter again under this president, you have to show a carbon intensity reduction requirement before you can take LNG off of a barge in Malaysia or in the European Union. So if you can demonstrate that CO2 management is not just a Biden-era green news scam, then I think conceptually that is the work of a GR team, of a policy team, of a lobbying team, to be able to articulate how your tech doesn't change the merits, the core fundamentals of who and how people invested in that tech, but you can right-size it to this administration. Tactically, though, I think some of the same kind of government affairs tools that several on this panel and in this audience are familiar with become doubly important. When I said that we won money to scale out from the West Coast to the Gulf Coast, we placed that facility in Speaker Mike Johnson's district. I wish I could tell you that we were prescient and we knew what the election outcome was, but by being a green climate tech initiative funded under the president, but working in a MAGA-oriented, or someone can claim that to be a red-leaning, MAGA-oriented state, what it did is it made that it pushed us as a company to not be normative in our values, but to work with the energy majors who are very, very good at managing CO2, to work with local chambers, work with the Speaker's office, and work with the full Louisiana delegation, who all but one member of Congress happens to be a Republican. And what that has allowed us to do is both talk about the concept differently and then leverage those relationships to make calls to the Department of Energy, to the White House Energy Dominance Council. I can't say we have it figured out, but in March we were on a DOGE termination list, and we have not been terminated yet. So I think some of this is going to be more art than science, but we've been finding some of the repackaging and the tactical leverage of relationships within the House Republican caucus to work to our advantage.
What about you, Phil? Do you have, I mean, obviously I think the political valence is not as extreme in something like autonomous vehicles, but I imagine that there still is like a difference in priority between the administration, or maybe not, I don't know. But have you changed your strategy, or is it kind of business as usual for you and in your interfacing with the government?
Yeah, so we're just starting as a company to interface with the government, but during my time at Tesla and other places, I think it's the same thing. It's the engagement that's important, especially when you have new technology. And so I didn't do a lot of this at Tesla with the US government, but I saw others do it, where they took both regulators and lawmakers on drives in Washington, D.C., near your home, showing them what an electric vehicle was. Because I think most of them thought electric vehicles are fun on the weekend. It's great to drink a beer and hit some golf balls while you drive your electrical vehicle around the golf course. But that's not what we wanted to sell as Tesla. So it first started with what is an electric vehicle? What's a 100% electric vehicle that can drive on the roads? And so the engagement with regulators and lawmakers was important then, and I think it's equally important now. I did some work for Tesla entering into China, and in China, when you get a license to sell vehicles, you also have to show that you can, you can service them as well. So that's an essential part of it. And getting the service license in a country that didn't have electrical vehicles, but had a standard of what was required in a service shop, including one of those things where you put in the tailpipe to measure emissions, was an interesting thing. Talking to regulators in China about why we didn't need that, but it was still on their checklist. And the advice I got from people in China that were helping us to get our license was, just buy it. The regulations won't change overnight. You'll have to work like you did in the United States, here in China, to change the regulations. Go with the flow a little bit, keep explaining things, and over time, regulations will change. So it's all about, I think, engaging with the right people in the government, explaining the technology, and trying to have them understand why it's in their interest to change the regulations as the future marches on.
Great. So this question, I think, will be for Vince and Mark. So this is a question I've been struggling through thinking about, especially with my students. When we, if I teach something like business administration, or students are going to go and with companies. So we have a new administration, which I think we can all admit is a transactional administration. Okay, like he's a mercantilist, and he believes in doing deals. In a world in which the political kind of back and forth, the thermostat seems to be changing repeatedly, how do you advise a company on whether or not it makes sense to play ball with the administration, whether or not you're going to get pushback in 3 or 4 years? How do you think through that political strategy when advising companies in terms of how much to be trying to work with this administration versus how much to be playing a wait-and-see approach?
When I advise clients and work with my colleagues, the first thing I tell them is to take a beat. And the tariff example is another one I like to bring up. We had a client call back in, this is before Liberation Day, if we can remember that far back. We had a client call who was a Canadian company that was working in steel, and they called at 10 o'clock and like, we're gonna get hammered with a 25% tariff. And I said, well, let's see what happens around 2 o'clock. Lo and behold, the tariffs went away at 2 o'clock. So first thing, you gotta take a beat. But underlying that is really trying to understand what the root policy issue that this administration is trying to get at. Another example is in the life sciences space. This president, when he was a candidate in 2016 before the JP Morgan healthcare conference, which a lot of us in this room know about, said drugs cost too much. Well, in April of this year, he showed you yet again that he believes drugs cost too much. And so what we tell clients is like, look at what you're being told when that thing about someone shows you who they are. Well, when a regulator shows you what they want to regulate, start to think about it that way, and start to build that long-term. I think Vikram hit it on this long-term strategy that allows you to position yourself. And the last thing on the transactional piece is, I know it's hard, right? It's hard to separate the person from the action, which is another thing that we tell our clients is, everyone, I'm not here to tell people don't feel a certain kind of way, they all do. But understand that there may be actually disadvantages to not moving first. If you look at the Pfizer example for the deal that they cut, which I think was based, again, on the 3-year tariff relief, because they already have domestic manufacturing, they moved first and forced everybody else to move behind them. So, what we tell clients, and again, I'm not telling clients go run to the White House because a lot of them aren't Pfizer. But I'm telling them to look at that transaction, understand from a CEO, from a board perspective, if you are approached by the government for an equity stake or some type of transaction, evaluate it. No money's free from the government. It all comes with strings. Sometimes they're thick strings, thin strings, or 10 strings. There's 1 string. Again, it's our money. But there's something behind that, and there's a policy goal that is underlying that. That is something that you may be able to get behind.
Yeah, and just to kind of level set, I mean, you're naming some household name companies, and I certainly, am lucky enough to work with some of them, but they're all in the technology sector, and so they're at a little bit of a different stage of development. And it's an interesting question, and I'll take 2 companies where, to use the words that I used when I was answering the first question, the wind is at their backs right now. So I have a defense tech company, and they are working with the Department of Defense, ICE, other organizations, and the government contract numbers are staggering, and they were unfathomable 2 years ago. But they also know it might not be forever. So part of what they're doing is they, have very good advisors who are educating not only, the Republican members in Congress and all the tentacles with that, but the Democratic members as well, as to the benefits of their technology and how they can be used, but they know it might not be forever. I also have an energy company where it's one of those companies where the government wants to put money into that company, and they're not struggling with this, but they know that money might not be available. It might be challenged in the future. It might be challenged as soon as after next year's midterm elections. And, as an outside counsel, all we can do is kind of advise on the state of play and what's possible to come next. And so they go into that with their eyes wide open. But this educational process is really important in terms of setting the stage, even if the political winds are very different in 2 or 4 years than they are currently. And so we're having a lot of those conversations with our companies in a variety of different sectors. But these two are examples of companies that, to some extent, can't believe their good fortune currently, but they're also preparing that that fortune might not last forever.
That's interesting, because I mean, from the outside, as somebody who, it does seem as though, especially when you think of tech being out here on the West Coast, there's just been such a massive change in what you're hearing from the companies, the way they're acting. And so for me, like, this topic of this question is like, in this era, I'm like, and again, a lot of this is the most high profile, most visible kind of controlled companies where they don't have to worry about much. So maybe this is just what they always felt, and they've been free. But it does seem to me that it's a risk, and I imagine that behind the scenes that they're considering the risk, but you never really know. And so, I don't know. It does seem that if you were to look from like 2020 to now, what you're hearing in terms of regulation, in terms of desire to change. I mean, we've talked about the whole shift in discussions of DEI. Like, so much has changed, and it's unclear if this is a permanent change or if this is a whipsaw. And so, it makes sense. You focus on the midterm and you try to kind of guide them. But are there any other kind of strategies you have, especially with the SEC and falling back? But also
picking up on Mark's point, and that as well is like, we think back, I've been in DC for a long time. Like in dog years or normal person years, it feels like I've been in DC for 150 years. But it's only been 30. Shout out Santa Clara Law School. But what we've seen is, and I used to work on the Hill. I had worked during a 12-year majority that was preceded by a 40-year majority, and since that, we've gone 4-4 in terms of the length of time for a majority. We've had a president that, after 2 successive 8-year terms, has gone 1-1-1, notwithstanding the protestations of all the folks in the 22nd Amendment and that. So the pace of policymaking is light speed faster than we've seen. And so I think subsequent to that is the regulatory environment. And now I think this administration, that's why you're seeing a lot of things being put in place now. And his messaging is very interesting, because when you think about his regulatory messaging, the administration will come to you and say, well, what do you want, more regulation? I'm just trying to do something a little bit different, because they know their time is short. Yeah. And they know they have to put this stuff in place before the bell rings. And the bell could ring, almost a year from now in 26, or the bell can ring in 28.
Do you think they're more aware of this? So I guess that's another thing, a question I had. This is, the second Trump administration with an interlude. Are they acting, aside from the priorities, policy priorities, which we can discuss, that they're focusing on different things, are they more effective? When you're advising your clients, are they more responsive than they were the first time? Is it more organized? Do you think that there's a more coherent strategy that helps you perhaps with your client? Again, from the outside, it seems to me that they've got it together a little bit more this time.
I think they had a go around. COVID kind of messed up the back end of it, but they had one go around. The president has talked about the fact that he didn't really know what he was doing. People would argue maybe that's the case now, but from an infrastructure, from a political and policy infrastructure perspective, I definitely think it's a little bit better now. Now, I think, to Vikrum's point, your framing, your messaging, your level of interaction, to whom you're speaking is critical. And I think you should, if you don't have GR help, go get GR help. Of any sort, because you'll have someone who can have that strategic vision. But I do think they are more sophisticated, and they've started to dial everything around domestic security. And that is both the kind of from the immigration perspective, that's the national security, the China stuff. If you look at the core of it, it's trying to make people in this country who are citizens feel safer. Now, not everything is working. The messaging sometimes falls apart. The actions are sometimes atrocious. But if you think about what they're doing, that's where this regulatory agenda is. I'm trying to make companies stronger. I'm trying to make America stronger. I'm trying to put our adversaries on the wrong foot. That's what we're trying to do. And I get talking to a startup CEO or a CLO, that's tough. That's a lot of high-level stuff, and I got to go build something because my investors that Mark is working with has told me, go build your thing. Yeah. But it's not a luxury anymore. right? You need to have at least some beginnings of a landscape view around the regulatory environment.
And I was just going to build on that because I think Vince makes a really good point on the security side. You know, being on the West Coast, Web 2.0 and like sort of the era in which Obama was actually importing a lot of talent from LinkedIn, from Twitter, from Google inside the White House, that was all about democratizing access to tech, the smartphone and the introduction of the app economy that, you know, all of us in this room, I'm sure, benefited from all the billable hours of those companies. What's different is that those access points were about sharing those products out to the world. Now what we're noticing, at least in a couple of sectors, is that something happened in the last 9 months. DeepSeek came online. And when that happened, ChatGPT and the race on AI was an arms race, and America had to win it. So if you're in the AI or the technology space, tapping into this consideration that the administration wants the US to be first, the US to win, is a big consideration whether you're a pre-seed, A, B, or IPO level company. The same is true for commercial fusion. If you're in these kind of harder tech energy spaces, some of which that this administration is funding at scale, nuclear, geothermal, commercial fusion deals are being announced in America, but in part because China and Germany are heavily investing in this space too. America wants to win that race. So I do think it's incumbent on people who are CLOs or heads of policy, such as myself, to advise the boardroom that if you do have a nexus to something that this administration could see as critical and wants to be protectionist about its growth, therein lies an opportunity in which, like, maybe you don't want to go out and cut a deal in America, but you should pay attention to what the administration is saying, what the DOE secretary or fill-in-the-blank department is saying about these things. And then on top of that, if you would rather back away, and if you'd rather seek opportunity of siting or development either quietly at the subnational level within the states of America or internationally in Canada or the European Union, that means that the rest of your company that's making these decisions cannot freelance government affairs expert, right? And I think that's a dangerous product or outcome of what's happening now. Everyone is pontificating on what the Trump administration tweet on Truth Social means, what Mr. Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, might mean for your industry. And I think now is the time that we try to integrate within the boardroom and within the C-suite some sort of set up infrastructure to traffic through all that noise and make intelligent decisions. Whether the decision is to not engage, that might be fine. But I do think that it's important that you can either A, tap into the national security, kind of the security framing that Vince mentioned in a certain industries, or at least provide some amount of rigor, build a GR shop, and suss out some of that intel so you aren't just kind of being whiplashed willy-nilly.
Makes sense. All right, we have just a couple minutes. I feel like we could end with, I'd be curious to hear maybe quickly, 30 seconds from each of you, about what do you think would be beneficial from a regulatory perspective for what you do going forward? What could this administration do if you're being constructive, if we're trying to be constructive here? What could they do? Obviously, for you advise a whole range of companies. This might be kind of, but what would you like to see from a regulatory perspective in the next 2 years?
I'd like to see more clarity and more of a acknowledgement of the regulatory process. It still exists, right? We talk about executive orders, but executive orders are not self-executing regulation. They can't substitute there. There's still, whether we believe it or not, there's still a procedure, there's still laws around the issuance of regulation. I'd like to see a return to that so people can understand how to engage. And I would also like the administration to continue to evangelize the importance of the connectivity with our trading partners worldwide and the connectivity to states. We talked about the Silver State. I'm a Nevadan, so people need to pay attention not just to Sacramento, but it's to Carson City, and it's to DC, and it's to Brussels, and it's to Beijing, because what sometimes the administration misses is that we try to build things here, but sometimes we can't, and we need to buy things from someplace else. And if you can't do it in DC, sometimes the states need to lead. So I'd like to see a little bit more of that.
Real quickly, for my company and the autonomous industry, formal engagement with NHTSA, the Highway Safety Transportation Administration, on autonomous rules that make sense to promote the growth of this industry in a safe and efficient manner.
On the grant review side, I'm biased because we're going through a DOGE review right now. Just rip the Band-Aid off and make a decision. This uncertainty is a problem, and so I think quick decisions there. And then this is maybe putting on my political hat, but Congress needs to show a little bit of a backbone on the power of the appropriations. A lot of us in this room and our clients will make decisions based off of the fact that the Appropriations Committee is moving X million or billions of dollars to a variety of the cabinet agencies that maybe your clients can then plug into. If that can just be unwound, or OMB can have these pocket rescissions that just turn its back on the separation of powers between the executive branch and legislative branch, that's a problem for business certainty. So I'd like to see maybe Congress lead a little bit there.
I thought you ran out the clock, so I thought I was free from this. But in what I do, I help companies fundraise, whether they be private companies or public companies, and then I help public companies, act as public companies. I would like to see the process, especially of going public and being a public company, be a lot easier. You look at the number of IPOs, and there's a lot of factors with this. The numbers are way down, and they continue to be down. The expenses of being a public company or going through that process, have skyrocketed during my career. I would like to see a real focus on what helps companies grow, create jobs, go do the tremendous things that you see these technology companies do, and have regulations help companies do that.
Make the class easier for me to teach as well. Yeah, there you go. All right, thank you all. This was really, really useful conversation from my perspective. So, thank you.